Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good morning. I'm back here. I'm on my way. I know, I'm on my way up. Don't worry. I'm here. Just turning on the recording, and I thought there'd be that awkward pause if people watch from my walk up talking then. What? I do. You just got to kind of walk a little bit. Helps wake you up. Well, I'm so glad everybody's here. I'll open us with a word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Preston and Mac, yeah. We'll be praying for them. Dear God, I thank you for today that we're able to get together and look some more at your history in the Old Testament. Be with our study this morning. Be with Preston and Mac as they're going through their health issues. Just heal them up, get them back to 100%. We'd love to see them here with us next week. In your name I pray, amen. All right, so last week we finished up the time of the exile. The exile, exactly. And this week we're moving into the last section of Israel's history. We remember at the very beginning, I outlined Israel's history in 4 parts. We're now at part 4. We're going to be looking at the beginning of the return and redemption. This is the beginning of the final section of Israel's history, return and redemption. And it's called the return because they're coming out of exile. And I have it illustrated kind of in a timeline form, if you will, on my whiteboard, courtesy of John Blackmore, of, yeah, we dug this out and it had all kinds of stuff on it that didn't want to erase. So Dad said, well, I'll take it home and spray it off. So he got it all cleaned up, and I got it here. Israel's return is divided into 3 different waves, 3 different groups, 3 different times when the people of the exile returned from exile back to Jerusalem. The first wave is in 538 BC, and that is with Zerubbabel leading it. It's the first one we're going to talk about this week. And Zerubbabel, just a quick side note on him, we're going to see he is a descendant of David. And if you go to the beginning of the book of Matthew and are looking in the genealogy of Jesus, you will see him appear there too. So again, his mention in the book of Ezra does show God continuing the line of David to bring about the Messiah. Again, God's providence and his plan, his promises will come true. He said it's going to be from the line of David. The line of kings was pretty much broken at the time of the exile, but just because there was no king in the land, David's house continued through Zerubbabel. In the reign of King Cyrus was the king of Persia who took over, he decrees that all the exiles can return. It's found in Ezra chapter 1, starting in verse 2. This is the decree by Cyrus. It says this: "This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judea. Any one of his people among you, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem and Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem. And the people of any place surrounding survivors may now be living in the land are to provide them with gold, silver, and with goods and livestock, with free will offering for the temple of the God in Jerusalem." So when Cyrus becomes king, he has Daniel as his advisor, and he gets this revelation from the Lord to say, build a temple to the God in Jerusalem. So he issues an edict to get everyone, all the exiles that want to go back, can now return home to build the temple on order of the king, which is very important because it means no one can refute that they're going to rebuild the temple, because the king decreed he wants the temple built. So Zerubbabel, who is called Sheshbazzar in Ezra as well, that's a different name for the same person. He's called the Prince of the Jews, so saying he is part of the royal family, is appointed governor, and he gets together a large number of people, and they all begin to march back towards Jerusalem to fulfill the edict of the king. Their goal is to rebuild the temple. That is what they were sent out to do. So Zerubbabel, with all his guys, all this huge group, it was over 30,000 in some accounts of this mass exodus of the people from exile. It's listed in Ezra chapter 2. You get a list of all the people and all the stuff. It even says Cyrus gifts the Israelites, the Jews, he gifts them all of the articles of the temple that was taken by them from King Nebuchadnezzar. So Zerubbabel gets all of the stuff, a bunch of gold, a bunch of silver, and they all start to make it back to Jerusalem. And when they arrive in Jerusalem, they are greeted by a whole bunch of, hey, the kids, adorable. Sorry, I got sidetracked. If I got sidetracked, you most definitely got sidetracked there a second. But so they go back, and when they get to Jerusalem, they are greeted by people who are living in the land. It's what the Jews call the Gentiles, that have settled in all of the land of Judea, all around Jerusalem. They all settled there. When they return, it starts off good, because they show the king's edict. Everyone's excited to rebuild the temple. It says the surrounding nations at first, they give them the goodwill offerings. And Zerubbabel starts to rebuild the Temple Mount. They come to ask him, they say, hey, let you rebuild this. And him, knowing that they are Jews and these people are not Jews, and that the Lord, and all throughout Israel's history, has commanded people, don't intermix with the people of the land, they say no to any part in what we're building. What we are building is to the Lord. You are not Jews. You have our history. You need to leave. And this starts what becomes the longest blood feud in history. Because now you have the people of the land who had been living there being kicked out of the homes they had built by the Jews and told, you have no part in what we're doing, you need to leave. So they kick them out, and it begins, and Zerubbabel starts to rebuild the temple foundation and the altar. And while he's doing that, the surrounding nations start to oppose this reconstruction, because now they're realizing this Jewish nation that's coming home is going to start to rebuild. First, they'll rebuild the temple, then they'll rebuild the city, and pretty soon they're going to take all of our land. So they start to get angry because the Jews had been kicking them out of the land. And they start to get angry at this, and as the temple is being reconstructed, it says Zerubbabel first gets the Temple Mount reconstructed, which is the foundation for what will become the second temple. They get that built, and they also rebuild the altar to the Lord. And everyone is super excited, mostly. It says there's about half and half. You got half the people who are excited because they can finally make sacrifices again. It says Zerubbabel does reinstitute the sacrifices. They make all these sacrifices to the Lord and begin to worship him. All the priests put on their priestly garments. Everyone's excited except a generation of people who had seen the first temple and are now seeing the shabby, reconstructed, ugly-looking temple that's being built, and it says they begin to cry and weep because it's not as glorious as the Temple of Solomon. So it's this divide in the people there of some are so excited because they're finally they're back in the land, we can worship, and then there's the other group who say, well, yay, we can worship, but it's not the same as it was. And that divide is just one of those things we see as Israel's history now. It's never going to be as glorious as it was during the reign of the house of David, but the temple started to be constructed now. And everything's going good until this point. Because those opposing nations that didn't want the temple rebuilt, they start to think, how can we stop the temple's reconstruction? So as you read through the first part of the book of Ezra, it's all about Zerubbabel's opposition that he faces. And it starts, they rebuild the altar. In chapter 3, it talks about that. Ezra chapter 3, you have the rebuilding of the altar. And it's then, right after that, they start to rebuild the temple. It says they collect the money to rebuild the temple. They pay carpenters and stonemasons. Everything's going great. And this opposing nations write a letter. And they don't write a letter to Zerubbabel, the governor of Judea. They write a letter back to the king and start to tell the king, who at this point is no longer King Cyrus. He has died. We're now in the reign of King Artaxerxes and Xerxes, who both are few kings. It went Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes. So, Zerubbabel, under King Cyrus and under King Darius, it was pretty good. They had it going good. The king was on their side. Now these opposing nations know that there's a new king who wasn't there when the edict was sent out, so they write him a letter and say, hey, they're rebelling against you. Don't you see that these people have a history of rebellion against the king? And they start to list off all of the history of the rebellions of the Jews against foreign occupiers. And as they list all this off, the king gets this letter and says, well, wait a second. Why am I okay with this if they're going to rebel against me? They can't do that. So now the new king issues another edict, and he says, you can't rebuild the temple anymore. And the construction is halted on the temple during the time of Zerubbabel. And it's pretty terrible because the temple's halted, but the people are still living there, so they start to build for themselves houses and homes and start to really make themselves have a comfortable life while the temple is barely even halfway done. And this goes on for a time period, and this is why it's important to look at the history as a timeline, because when you look at the Bible, as you look at the prophets in the back, you get Haggai and Zechariah, who are right along there with some of the prophets before the exile. And you're like, well, how do they connect? Well, during the time of Zerubbabel, when the temple construction is stopped, you get God sending two prophets to the returned exiles, Haggai and Zechariah, who both say, how dare you? You're living in these nice paneled houses, comfortable lives, while the temple of the Lord isn't even done. And it convicts the people, and they kind of almost rebel against the king again, because they say, all right, even though we're not supposed to do it by law, everyone hates us that we're doing it, we're going to still rebuild the temple. And they start to continue the reconstruction of the temple, and again, they write a letter to the king and say, listen, I know you don't like it, but King Cyrus said we can do this, so we have legal right to do this. They send the letter back to King Artaxerxes. He reads it, and he says, well, hold on. If King Cyrus said they can, why did I say they can't? It says he goes and he pulls up the record, edict of Cyrus that said Jews need to go rebuild the temple of the Lord. And he says, oh, okay, well, they need to do this. And the plan of the opposing nations backfires, because then he sends another letter that says, all right, now go ahead and give them all the materials they need to rebuild it. Give them gold and silver and more offerings for the Lord. That's what the king's new edict is sent out. And under the time of Zerubbabel, the first wave, they rebuild the temple. And everything is going pretty good. They got the temple. They reinstitute temple worship. The priests, the Levites start doing their job. Everything is great, except for the fact that the Israelites, the Jews, they don't really know the law of Moses anymore. They know some of it. They're trying to live by some of it. They know they need to make sacrifices, but they don't live the way they're supposed to live. It says after the temple's built, they start to intermarry with the Gentiles there and start to kind of fall into some of the same practices that they'd always been falling in. Enter a man named Ezra, who the book is named after. It's credited as his own writing, but in 458 BC, Ezra, and as you look at his introduction in chapter 7, my bad, Ezra chapter 7, as you look at his introduction, it gives you a lineage of the man Ezra, and it traces him back all the way to Aaron. So he is a priest from the priestly line, and it says in his, as it talks about him, he knows the law of Moses like nobody else ever did. So this is a learned man who knows the law. He's a priest. He hears about what's going on back in Jerusalem, and he realizes they need to know what God's commands are. So he gets together with him a whole group of priests and Levites, and they start to set out, and it's an interesting story on their setting out is as they go, the king says, why don't you take some soldiers to protect you on the road? But Ezra tells the king, we don't need your protection, we have God's protection. So he gets together with them, and they start to set out. He realizes Not all of the people who say we're Levites and priests can trace their lineage back to Levites and priests. And trying to follow the law as it says, he does tell them, you need to stop. You're not a Levite, you're not a priest, go home. It says he does kick out the people that he can't trace back, because he knows the law of Moses says we need to follow these commands. And that's what he's going to do. So he returns to Jerusalem in 458, and he returns with the purpose to return the people back to God. It's under King, I believe it's King Artaxerxes there, is the ruler at this time. Under his guidance, Ezra returns to the land. He gets there. He starts to see that, oh, all these people, they don't know what they're doing. They're living sinful lives. As Ezra sees the sinful lives of the people, he's cut to the core. And he starts to pray in the temple out loud, weeping and wailing, asking for God's forgiveness because the people aren't following the commands that the Lord has said. And as he's weeping and wailing, everyone else starts to see this, and they all start to weep and wail at this. And Ezra gets before all the people and he says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to follow the law of Moses, and all of you who have foreign wives and foreign children, they need to leave. And again, there's this mass exodus from Jerusalem of all the people who are not Jews. And it says, anyone who does not kick out his wife must leave Jerusalem to go be with them. And all of these people who leave that are half Jewish, half Gentile mixed breeds, who can guess where they go to settle? Samaria, exactly. All of these people that get kicked out of Jerusalem again all go to Samaria and settle there. And this, like I said, is the beginning of that feud between the Jews and the Samaritans. Because now not only is it people who are angry that they were told you can't help rebuild the temple, but now it's even some Jewish people and some people who are connected to the Jewish line that have been kicked out because they weren't following the law of Moses. And this divide sets in as Ezra brings the people back to God during his time. There's the whole other group of Samaritans that are both worshiping Yahweh but also worshiping other gods that are beginning to hate and come up against the Jews at every turn. And we're going to see this more dramatically as we continue to look at the history as we go into the book of Nehemiah. We're going to talk about him next week because, frankly, there's a lot in Nehemiah, and I want to give it ample time. But as we look at Nehemiah, we're going to see even more of the division that comes between the Samaritans and the Jews, because they never get along because they're all fighting for the same territory. They all think they have the same claim on Jerusalem, and they're all continuously arguing over where do we worship, how do we worship, why did we not get to stay, why did we get to stay. It's all these arguments that ultimately come from the time of the return. Because when Zerubbabel came back, he faced insurmountable odds of telling people that said, oh, we're willing to help. He said, because you're not part of us, because you're not part of our people, you're not part of the people of the promise, you're not allowed to help, and kicked them out. That made them angry. Then he faces, again, the insurmountable odds of a king saying, if you continue to rebuild the temple, I'm going to come and I'm going to kill you all. It's essentially what it is, because by defying a king's decree, you are in open rebellion against that king, and when you're in open rebellion against the king is most likely going to come and kill you. But Zerubbabel doesn't care, because whenever they're prompted by God and God tells them, listen, you were doing what you were supposed to be doing but got sidetracked and distracted by the people who came against you, you need to return to me and continue doing the work that I have set out for you to do. That's what he does. He answers the call and rebuilds the temple. Then, as good as a person as he is, and as good as a governor and as good as a leader he is, they still fall into the same sins over and over, which is why Ezra does return to tell the people, here's what the law of Moses says. Because it goes beyond of what they wanted to here's what the law commands. So that's essentially the beginning of the people is the book of Ezra that talks about the first two waves. Like I said, next week we're going to talk about the third wave, but I'm going to leave some time here for questions over anything we've talked about so far. whether it's the book of Ezra or anything of Esther or Daniel. And I will say during the time of Zerubbabel and Ezra, right in here, right in this kind of dividing line there, is where Esther would have taken place. Because as you look at the line of kings, you have Cyrus, Darius, King Xerxes, who was Esther's husband, and then Xerxes' son Artaxerxes after him. So just for a little bit of context on how you're looking at that, that's how the story progresses. It was during that time of, if we remember the book of Esther, the anti-Jewish sentiment across the Persian Empire at that time went all the way up even into the king's own court. But Esther, a woman following God's plan, says, listen, here's what we need to do. I'm a Jew, you can't do this. Essentially is what the book of Esther is. But, yeah, so that would happen right in the in-between time of Zerubbabel's return and Ezra's return. Now, are there any questions over anything? Because we've covered a lot of stuff over the last few weeks.
Is Zerubbabel the last king then?
Zerubbabel is kind of. He's appointed governor. He's from the house of David. The line of kings does go through him, but he isn't ever the king. He's the governor over that region of the Persian Empire. Because how the Persian Empire was laid out is you had the king, but then under him, he would have all of these, what they called like satraps, which were regional governors to rule over different parts of his empire. Because it was so massive that one person couldn't rule over all of it, so he had his satraps, his governors, that would rule in his stead for the most part. And that was what Zerubbabel was appointed to. And as we'll see later in the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah is also appointed as governor of the same area after Zerubbabel. But that is his role, is he's part of the kingly line, but never king. There won't be another real king until the intertestamental times. Because after the Persians, you have the Greeks who conquer. Then you have the time of the Greek generals who take over, the 4 generals who take over the Greek Empire. And then there is a short period where Israel rebels against their Greek overlords and sets in their own king, their own nation, for just a brief time before Rome comes and conquers. That is a good question. While he is from the line of David, Zerubbabel was not a king. Any other questions over anything in the history? Because we've talked about a lot of stuff over the last few weeks. I think it's been roughly 12 or 13 weeks of just information and timeline, and I know I can get myself confused as I start talking. So just want to make sure everyone's kind of understands where we're at.
From that span to that span, how many years do you think that roughly was?
Like the whole return?
Yeah.
Almost 100 years.
So it went through like, what, 4 kings?
Yeah, because there were about 4 kings of Persia. And then, because, it goes from 538 all the way to 32 is the time span of the return. And those are approximate dates. You can look up and there's all these different, dates are difficult with the Old Testament, and I'm just going to go ahead real briefly tell why, because it is kind of interesting. So how you get dates for a lot of the Old Testament times is really smart people say, okay, there was a solar eclipse on this day in history, and they can equate that to something that was recorded during one of the Book of Kings or something from an ancient king, and they can be, okay, that's roughly 500 BC, and then they kind of work backwards from there. So a lot of Old Testament dates, if you look them up or try to study them, you'll get commentaries or even articles that have different dates for a lot of these things, and it's because all of these are approximately that much time. Because it's hard to say this was the year of when this happened, because every time a new king would come into power, usually the whole calendar would change based on that king's preference or that king's birth. So real briefly, these are all approximate dates of when this happened. But it is roughly that amount of time, about 100 years is the return in 3 waves. That's a good question, though. Any other questions?
I have one. I don't know the date. This is all during the Persian Empire.
Mm-hmm.
When the world. All right. So when did the Greeks? When is the kind of the official beginning of the Greek Empire?
The beginning of the Greek Empire would be when Alexander the Great conquered the Persians. That you could, probably Google it on your phone if you want. I could right now, but I feel like it'd be distracting.
How much time after Nehemiah
Um,
that he did take over?
Probably not that long. I don't know. If somebody wants to, look it up. Because Alexander the Great is the one who conquers the Persians. He defeats their armies and takes over their whole empire. Madison, are you looking it up? 334. So almost 100 years again after this is when the Greeks conquer. So yeah, that's good. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? If not, we can do some prayer requests and close with a word of prayer, and then have some time for coffee and donuts.
Where did he die?
Daniel is probably died during or just after the reign of King Darius. Because as we see Daniel, the last big event that we see Daniel is Daniel in the lion's den, and that's during the reign of King Darius. So, and then right after that, you have King Xerxes, who institutes a plan to exterminate the Jews based on one of his advisors. So, again, one would think if Daniel was alive at that time, he would still be in the king's court and be able to be that advisor. So Daniel probably dies towards the end of King Darius's reign. Middle or end of King Darius's reign is probably when he dies.
We don't know if
we don't
to see the first return or not.
No, we don't. He could have died even before then, yeah. Because we do know, even in some of his prophecies, Daniel is pretty much told by God, you go home and die, and then you'll wake up and do an eternal glory. And that's kind of what in his last vision he gets, which tells us Daniel never really returns to Jerusalem. Because in his prayers, he's saying, God, when do we get to go back? God says, I have a plan, but you're not going to be there for it. So we really don't know if he saw it or not, but he was alive during the reign of King Cyrus, which means he would have probably heard about it but been an old man and not able to go travel with them. Yes, Esther takes place after Daniel. After Daniel's gone, Esther comes during the reign of King Xerxes, who's a few kings after. So yeah.
This is not a question. I think it's important.
Do it.
Word. We always talk about God will save a remnant. You see that in the New Testament. So I think it's real important. Most of the Jewish people that left in the Babylonian captivity, most of them did not return.
Mm-hmm.
Like Esther never returned. She never denied God. They lived out there. Mordecai, they lived faithfully as Jews, but in the foreign land. But it's like 30,000 went, which isn't a great number. Some went with Ezra, then some went with Nehemiah. But really, of those who were deported, not many really came back into the land. It was probably the fervent, we would say,
Zealous.
What's the word? Fundamentalist.
The
one, and probably it would be the ones that had based all their existence on the return of that king,
Mm-hmm.
of the Messiah. So that's why when they get back, it is a very zealous small group of the Jewish nation that returned, but it was the ones that were thinking now the Messiah will come, the one the prophets were talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think kind of remember that. It doesn't mean the
militaristic.
Yeah.
Kind of, yeah.
And you'll
Yeah.
see that.
The ones that come
Ezra,
back.
Nehemiah.
Yeah, the ones that came back, and that's why, like, Ezra kicks out all of the intermarried people, is because he says, listen, those aren't Jewish people. They're not people of the promise. This is what God told us we need to do. We need to stay focused on that. This, again, does kind of spark some of that, what we see in the New Testament, the order of the Pharisees, and the very legalistic mindset is because they were like, if we all follow the law of Moses perfectly, then the Messiah will come back. That was the thinking of a lot of the returning Jews. So, when we get to the New Testament, the reason, a lot of the persecution is because the fundamentalists would say, listen, we all need to, as a Jewish people, we need to be 100% following the law. So if they would get some of these sects, which is what they viewed Christianity at the beginning, that's why they would go out and kill them all, is because they said, listen, if we can't get them to convert, we'll kill them, and then we'll be all back to 100%. Kind of like the outlier. It says, we got 99%. We could try to bring that 1% back, or let's just go ahead and we'll kill them, and then we'll be at 100%. That was their mathing. So that is kind of what we start to see here with the return is this is what we got to do. And especially when Ezra comes back being...
He said, military-minded.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes sense then when you talk about Nehemiah.
Yeah.
Because Nehemiah
Yeah.
said that, keep your swords in one hand and build with your other.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, they were all of the ones who come back were ready to fight, bleed, and die in Jerusalem to make sure that they had their city.
And just on that with the Apostle Paul, like from our mindset, how could he go out and kill people? But in his mind, being a descendant of this zealous, and he says, I was zealous without knowledge, he was trying to protect the people from doing what they had always done in the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
Betray God. So these were the purists, and they didn't. So
Yeah.
that kind of explains a little bit the Pharisees and that the rebellion against Jesus, because Jesus came preaching not at all what they had been taught.
Mm.
It's a time period they come up with their 614 other traditions and all the legalism.
Yeah.
So anyway,
That's a good point to bring in.
Not teaching.
No, you're good. Because that
That's
helps
why it's
put it in
relevant to understanding
the
when we come to
context of the New
You can
Testament.
understand a little bit of that background, and like Paul's going, man, I'm the man of God here. I'm doing exactly what should have been done.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Other thoughts before we close with a word of prayer? Going once, twice, 3 times. All right. Prayer requests. Anyone?
Pray for our church. A lot of unsettled stuff going on.
Hmm.
We need to pray, as I said Friday in the video, that we show love for one another.
Hmm. All right. I'll close this. Oh.
You got one.
Yeah. We'll pray for him. All right. I'll close this with a word of prayer. Dear God, again, I thank you for today that we're able to be here and just talk through some of the history here and look at your story and the continuation of your promise in the Old Testament. As I'm praying here, just thinking of Mac and Preston with what they're going through. Be with them. Be with Alyssa's grandpa and his medical issues he's got. Just show your hand in all those situations and be here with us at the church. We got some unrest and some unease going on, and just be with all our hearts. Help us show love to one another, because it's easy to say show love, but sometimes it's harder to actually show the love. So just help us be a good witness of your love to one another and to our community. In your name I pray, amen.